Hello, my name is Jordan Casey, and you are listening to Revised History and Disasters, where we cover alternate timelines of history and describe how these events may unfold. Today's topic is, what if there was a zombie outbreak on the Western Front in World War I? And we will be covering the lead up to these events, personal and geopolitical perspectives, and the consequences of these events. Let's dive right into it. So we will be following the character Fritz Haber in World War I, approximately August 20th, 1918 in northern France. And the inspiration for this is the movie Trench 11 and the Call of Duty Zombies map Origins, where they dive into a fictional perspective of zombies in World War I. So currently, Germany is on its last legs in the First World War. Millions have been killed. Millions have died from the influenza epidemic. Germany's high command is in shambles, and the Allies are about to breach the Hindenburg Line, which is Germany's last line of defense. Germany is running out of options. So they instruct Fritz Haber, the current head of Germany's Chemical Warfare Division, to create a synthetic chemical agent that will destroy the Allied advance. So he begins work at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry and Electrochemistry in Berlin, Germany. Fritz decides to use human test subjects that are in critical condition due to the ongoing influenza epidemic. He uses these human trials to get the results he needs. And he accidentally discovers this incredible superhuman. He learns that these new test subjects are enraged and are always in a constant state of insanity and are always trying to kill their inhabitants. Fritz shows this to Kaiser Wilhelm, one of the newest test subjects he calls Subject Zero. He says to the Kaiser, "This will completely decimate the Allies on the Western Front. We will soon win this great war." So Kaiser Wilhelm looks at this stuff and says, "Yeah, this is a great idea. Deploy it immediately. Send it to northern France, and we'll see how this goes. Get right on it, buddy." Fritz Haber is now ready to go. He's deployed to northern France. Fritz Haber deploys his first super soldier. August 29th, 1918. Fritz Haber deploys his first super soldier and sends him over no man's land. The soldier is running and sprinting to the Allied lines from a certain scent from the influenza epidemic. Agent Zero runs over to the Allied lines because he can smell the influenza on the Allied soldiers. He's sprinting over no man's land. The enemies shoot rifle at him, machine guns, and nothing is even phasing this guy. He dives into the trenches and starts biting the faces off of all of these soldiers. Chaos reigns. Afterwards, it got so horrendous that the Allies had to deploy flamethrowers into these trenches, including on their own men. They didn't know who was infected and who was to trust, so they had to burn those lines of defense. And Germany ran over no man's land to invade the trenches that were cleared out. There was only one issue, though. Some of these men that charged were infected by influenza and didn't even know about it. Agent Zero could smell this. He looked at all these other men that have just came over the lines and started sprinting at them and killing the German advance. Both the defenders and attackers are completely decimated. Allies send in reinforcements into the area, especially with flamethrowers, and Germany does the same. Chaos reigns amongst the high command in Germany. How could this be possible? Over 1 million men have died by the hands of very few, and the Allied head command is saying the same to their men. Both sides are very fearful of what can happen, and Fritz Haber is in shock for what his creature is capable of. The monsters start multiplying. Hundreds of thousands of them are now sweeping the enemy lines. They are sweeping both Germany and Allied troops. The whole entirety of the Western Front is another bloodbath, worse than it has ever seen. Tens of millions more die on the front. and they start to infect civilian populations. December 20th, 1918. The Western Front has been completely decimated, and they're completely isolated now. These monsters have completely taken out the whole front, and both governments are in shock. They start to infect civilian populations, and it's starting to decimate entire cities. Dusseldorf is completely wiped off the map. Ypres, Dunkirk, and all these other French cities are decimated as well. Not just from the war, but from the epidemic and these monsters. Every single Belgium city is wiped out. Tens of millions of civilians have died up to this point, and the total death count of the entire war has reached over 100 million. Each personnel on the Western Front, who is still alive and in relatively good health, are in charge of defending individual towns from these monsters. There is virtually no battle between the two governments. As a matter of fact, they've almost had a white peace treaty where their military personnel are pulled out of each other's countries and sent back home to defend their own homelands. There is no diplomatic relations between the two. Each soldier is now given a flamethrower. On the front lines, they're now referred to as zombies. The only way to kill these zombies is getting a perfect headshot, taking out the blood supply of the brain, or flame, which is the preferred choice in this time era. Any use of poison gas actually enhances the zombie's abilities, and it only mutates into a insane super soldier tank, almost like a boss. Like this is like a chemical boss. And these things require literal heavy machinery, like artillery needs to take these guys out. These individual towns have been completely wiped out, especially with the cold of the winter. 1918, this winter is cold. It's not even slowing the virus down. It's just making it worse. French troops mobilized to help out Paris, which is under constant siege from these zombies, and will be taken over momentarily. February of 1919. A vast majority of Western Germany has been completely wiped out. Everything west of Frankfurt and Nuremberg. There's very few signs of life, very few holdouts anywhere. Zombies just keep on spreading across the countryside. By this point, Paris has been wiped off the map, all of northern France, vast majority of Normandy and the coastlines. And they're fighting down in the south, in Vichy, France. This is where a lot of the remnants of the old French government is, and they are nearing capitulation. In Britain, the situation is not much better, because earlier that winter, they withdrew many of their troops back home. Unfortunately, many of those men were still infected. Primarily in London is a large infection of the undead, which is swooping across the entire city. Their government has relocated north to Scotland. June 23rd, 1919. The war has unofficially been seized. Because guess what? France doesn't exist. Germany doesn't exist. Matter of fact, Italy do not exist. Austria-Hungary has been completely dissolved by this epidemic. In Russia, with their civil war, hundreds of millions more have died. Almost the entire population has died due to the ongoing war and the influenza epidemic and these zombies. The situation is not much better in Great Britain. Everyone who has a pulse has migrated north to Scotland, and they have set up walls and parameters around the mountaintops, where the last remnants of Britain are hiding out in. Spain, even though it's a neutral country, was also decimated because of the zombies. A vast majority of all of Europe has been taken over. And the only exception is a few islands in the Mediterranean. Aside from that, they've all been taken out. Portions of Africa are under siege in the Middle East, and even some in China and Japan. The United States, on the other hand, has been desperately trying to keep out the zombie infection. They've cut off all trading, merchant ships. They've completely reverted back to isolationistic policies. In an attempt to try and curb these events, the United States proposes a legislation to completely annex Canada. Canada accepts, and they create the North American Federation. This was created as a defensive pact because they are one of the few nations left on Earth, And they make all these policies to try and prevent the spread of the infection into the United States. So at this point, the story can go one of two ways. Either the entire world besides maybe North and South America are killed, or the entire world is taken out. We'll go with both of these situations. Exhibit A. North America and South America completely defend them off. The year is 1920. The entire world, the old world, Europe, Asia, Africa, is completely decimated. No humans live there, except a few pockets of resistance here and there. North and South America, though, have been creating their unitary governments, try and manage their small amount of resources that they have. Inflation runs rampant in all of these countries, including in the United States, which is literally the breadwinner for all of these other nations. And it continues to be a very desperate situation. You know, in our timeline in the 1920s, it was economic prosperity, and they revert back to isolationism. In this timeline, things get real hairy. Because there is no other large nation to trade with, the North American Federation is left to rely completely on domestic product, which beforehand they did a lot of trading, but now they have to completely rely on it, and as well as trading with the South American neighbors, but not as much as they were used to. So at that point, the timeline just chugs along. Everyone is just completely shell-shocked from all of their boys dying on the front. At this point, 10 to 20% of the American population died in Europe. And so now they have a vacuum of loss of work. A whole generation has been completely decimated, and they don't have many workers. This takes America into a dark, deep depression. It remains there indefinitely. Worse than our timeline. Much worse than our depression in the 30s. This keeps going into the 40s and 50s, and this may even incite future civil conflicts. The second exhibit, the zombies take over the world. The year is 1919, and a vast majority of the other countries in Europe and Asia and Africa have died off. Even though the Americans have isolationistic policies, the Queen Mary carries over a batch of some refugees from other countries, the limited amount of ones that they're taking in. Guess what? One of the men there have been infected with the influenza virus. And this virus, of course, is the mutated variant of the zombie virus. Oh no, you can see where this is going. It starts in New York City, Long Island. The zombies run rapid in Queens and all these other portions of New York, Brooklyn. Everyone is in a frenzy and panic. What little air travel existed back then has been completely suspended. All trains have been suspended indefinitely on the East Coast. And there's mass migrations to the West Coast, to California and Oregon and Washington. At this point, the eastern seaboard is decimated. Massachusetts and Maine and Maryland, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. All of these places are just in complete chaos. Millions and millions are dying by the day. Everyone is in a frenzy panic to migrate west, and in the process, there are many people who are caught up in this who are killed off by the zombies. Some of these people remain infected, but do not show any symptoms. Many of them end up in Los Angeles or Seattle, Washington. The zombie infection starts to spread on the western seaboard. They all close in into the Midwest. The last batch of resistance in this timeline is in Kansas City, in Wichita, in Omaha, in Des Moines, Oklahoma City, Little Rock. These are the last bastions of humans in the North American Federation. The last remnants of any form of government has capitulated many months ago. Up until that point, with this last bastion of resistance was in about 1921, where the Americans, Canadians fought up a very valiant fight, but it was just hopeless in the wake of this virus. In 1921, the battle for Kansas City, and there's been a defensive wall set up around the city, around the Missouri River, on the eastern side and Independence, and as far south as Lee's Summit. The zombies are traveling in from the north, the east, the southwest, all angles. And this is where our boys put up a very valiant fight. Our boys and women at this point. I mean, everyone gets a gun. Everyone's equipped with flamethrowers. There's flame traps are surrounding the whole city. But the first breach is on the eastern side. They push in, decimate everyone on the Missouri side. And the last bastions of humanity in the entire North American Federation is in West Kansas City. From a population at the time in this fictional universe of 200,000, it has been wiped out off the map in 1921. And guess what? Everyone's dead now. Oh boy. The whole North American Federation has completely been decimated. Maybe the only remnants are left in like the northern islands of Canada, in the northern portions of Alaska, and maybe even Hawaii and some of the Pacific Islands. But then as the infection is spread up north, it goes south into Mexico, into Central America, and it goes down into Brazil and those South American countries. The date is February 3rd of 1922. The last human resistance is completely wiped out in the Americas. What's left is, as I mentioned, those remnants, a few isolated pockets. The world population at this point is maybe 10,000 people. But aside from that, everyone's dead. Oh boy, how incredible is that? And with that being said, you've been listening to Revised History and Disasters. I hope you all loved this amazing podcast. Hope you all tune in for the next one.